Hi, everybody. Welcome to my talk on Visual Basic. Thanks a lot for coming. Back in Redmond, we've been working hard adding the new features that you've asked for to the language, and it's great to be able to get in front of people finally, talk about the features, and get your feedback. I'm my own Carter, Program Manager of Visual Basic. I've been on the VB team for quite a while, quite a history with the VB language. When I started back in 1987 as a software developer, we were just starting the transition from DOS to Windows. And so we were looking at simplifying the language. We were looking at what did we need to add to the language to make it great for the Windows platform. Well, here we are 10, 13 years later. We started this effort about 3 years ago. Same situation. We're on the cusp here between Windows and moving to the .NET platform for the web. So it's a great opportunity to be here and tell you about the features. Most of the features, some of the features are object-oriented features. The title is a bit misleading because there is lots of new features. It takes more than just object-oriented features to update the language and bring it to where we need it to be. You might want, if you're not sitting close to a screen, you might want to move close to one because I'll be demonstrating a lot of code and it could be difficult for you to read it. Okay, when we start on a new version of product, of course, we have goals. One of them, there's sort of the Uber goals and then there's other goals. The Uber goals are add the features that you guys want. But we have to organize that. We have to have a strategy. What are we looking for in the new language? First of all, we needed to modernize the language. There are some features in there that have become antiquated. For example, in Chris Dice's talk yesterday, somebody asked if GoSub was there. Well, it's gone now. Good. It's good to hear that applause. It's crunch time. We're trying hard to ship this product as soon as it's possible. And your feedback will help me avoid any cuts that folks might suggest to the language in order to get this thing shipped. So I'm not going to shamelessly ask for your applause like Chris Dice did yesterday, who's my boss, by the way. That's okay because he went back to Redmond already. But you can, so just let me know. And if you hate something, if you don't like the fact that we may be removing GoSub, go ahead and boo. I don't care. So next item is to simplify. And simplifying it is all about making it consistent, making it behave the way you would expect to behave. Chris mentioned yesterday that we fixed dim x comma y as integer to mean what people think it means, declare x and y as integers. So that's an example of the simplification we're looking at. Reduced programming errors, and in later slides I refer to this as robustness, is all about avoiding errors at runtime that could be caught earlier in the development process. It's really bad news when you've shipped your product and you get the phone call saying that, oh, it encountered, it blew up, it had some exception. Well, we want to make sure that we catch in the compiler as many of the unexpected exceptions and warn you about them as possible. The example of that is simply the new stricter type checking. So if you assign a long integer, 4 bytes, to 2-byte integer, it'll tell you, you may not want to do this. You can think about it, you can decide that, yeah, that's what I really want to do and add an explicit cast, or you may need to rewrite your code. And the last item is full access to the .NET platform. This is maybe the most important thing. Back in '87, when we were looking at moving VB, or wasn't VB back then, it was Quick Basic, moving the basic language from DOS to Windows, we were in a situation where the Windows APIs already existed, pretty much. So we had to write a layer on top of Windows when we thought it needed to be simpler than it was. Well, we're in a better situation now. The .NET platform planning took into consideration what it takes to make things simple, what it takes to work with Visual Basic. So the evolution of the .NET framework and VB.NET were in parallel. Okay, I'll just drill down here a little bit on inheritance. Inheritance, the main advantage that inheritance brings is reuse. And we already had support for polymorphism through interfaces, but we didn't have any way to inherit implementation from base classes. So VB was the first language to really be successful with component programming. When it shipped, people started writing VBXs, people started writing OCXs later, and it was easy to take a form, plop third-party controls on it, and that way glue functionality together to build your applications as easily as possible. Well, what we didn't have was general inheritance. We had a limited form of inheritance. So VB programmers probably don't think of it this way, but every time they create a new form, they are creating a class that inherits. It inherits from the base form class. It inherits the properties, the methods, the events, the implementation of that properties and methods into your new form. Later, we expanded a little bit. We allowed other base classes to be defined. We used that for web classes. We used it for user controls and so on. But now we're finally opening up the box and saying, hey, I'll bet you'd like to define your own base classes, as you have let us know through the years. So just to give you a little summary of some of the features in inheritance, it's still base class inheritance rather than multiple base class inheritance. And that avoids all the problems associated with multiple base classes, the problems of what happens if you inherit the same class twice through two different classes. And C++ solved that problem with virtual base classes. And if you understand virtual base classes, that's wonderful. It also avoids collisions between inheriting two methods with the same name from two different classes. The next item is we support method and property overriding. So a class that inherits from a base class, by default, it gets the implementation from the base class, but you don't have to use it. You can replace the implementation in your inheriting class to change the functionality of that method. Last item here is protected access type. This is in addition to the current private, public, friend options that exist today. You can declare methods as protected in a class. These methods are only accessible to deriving classes. We also support what's called protected friend, and those members are accessible to all deriving classes as well as all other classes in the same project. Okay. There's a big difference between composition of components and inheritance with respect to the relationship between those two classes. It's a much tighter dependency when you have inheritance. And it's very easy when I modify a class to break the derived classes so that they either no longer maybe even compile, or that they don't, if I ended up removing a method, or they break in unexpected ways. So when we add inheritance to VB, we had to think about ways to make sure that we helped folks out with versioning issues. First of all, by default, methods are not overridable. And this is important because when you define a class, you really need to think about what the methods in the classes you want to be overridable. If you don't think about it, and you just, like in many other languages, the default is just overridable, then there's a good chance your class isn't really going to function in the way that it's supposed to if somebody comes along and overrides that method. Next, we support shadows, which is a way to hide inherited members. So this is useful if I've got a derived class with a method, say, named foo, and later somebody updates the base class foo, the base class, and adds a method with the same name. I need to add shadows on the declaration of my derived foo method so that it doesn't implicitly override the base class method. Those two things were defined at different times. You don't want to inadvertently have overriding. Last item on the slide is that classes can be declared as not inheritable. And this is sort of the ultimate weapon against having to deal with versioning problems of base classes. If you're defining a class and you want to be free to change it in more ways, then you can just mark the class as not inheritable. Okay, another important area of object-oriented programming where VB had to be improved is support for encapsulation. We have some support for encapsulation, but need a little bit more. One of the things that folks have often asked for is give me the ability to define a variable on a class where that variable is, there's just one of them for all instances of a class. The variable is shared between all instances. This is the equivalent of C++ static member declarations. Today, if you want this functionality in VB6, you have to define the variable in the standard module. Of course, that's not encapsulated. That exposes the variable to be accessed by other classes. Also, we allow nested type support. So if I'm building a linked list and I need a node class, the node class has, say, value field, it has a pointer to the next node, I can include the definition of node within my linked list definition, and nobody can access the node class because it's a private implementation detail. It should be encapsulated. Finally, structures have changed. They're a lot more general. Structures in VB6 were called types. We changed the name because that was somewhat confusing. After all, integer is really a type, and classes are types and so forth. So we call them structures now. The new structures support properties, methods, and events, same as classes, and they support interfaces. So you're going to ask, well, what's the difference then? What is it about structures that makes them different from classes? Well, they don't support inheritance. But more importantly, they have value semantics. If I have two variables of a structure type and I do an assignment from one to the other, then the contents of the structure gets copied. That's different from class, where two class variables, what happens is that the reference to a class gets assigned and you end up with two variables referencing the same thing. Structures, you don't reference the same thing. You end up with two copies. Okay, another critical, important feature for modernization of the language is structured error handling. And we still support on-error go-to. Thank you. We still support on-error go-to, partly because we feel like the resume functionality is useful in a lot of places, and it makes it easier for you to port your code, move your code forward. But support for structured error handling pretty much eliminates the need to use go-to. When you had an error go-to, almost inevitably you had to have some other go-tos in to branch around your error handlers and so forth. So the syntax, you've probably seen it in other talks, and I'll show you in a little bit, but basically there's the try statement. It's followed by a list of statements which are executed, and if exception occurs, then a list of catch blocks gets checked. The catch block filters on either the type of the exception or a general condition. And the finally block is always executed. Whether or not any of catch blocks executes, the finally block makes sure that if there's something that really has to happen before you exit, then you put it inside your try block. So the throw statement is also added as the way to generate a typed exception. So with the structured exception handling, you can define your own exception classes. You can put whatever information you need in there. You're not limited to what is in the default VB error object. And so when you want to throw an exception, you create a new instance of an exception class. There's a built-in one, or you can define your own. Populate that object with whatever information that you need to describe the exception. Okay. Do a little demo here. What I've got here, I'm just going to give you a little demonstration of inheritance. I've defined a queue class that implements a queue using an array. It's pretty straightforward. It's got the ifront data member, which is indexed into the array of where the queue currently starts, has the number of elements in the array, and the constructor takes the maximum size and initializes the array as appropriate. And stop that. And the add method, notice that I've declared it as overridable, so I can change the functionality in the derived class. The add method checks to see whether the queue is already full, the underlying array is already full. If it is, then it throws an exception, passing in an error message constant that is defined within the class. Otherwise, it just inserts the element into the array using modular arithmetic, so it'll wrap around the end of the array. So I see I've got a few errors here. Chris Dice yesterday talked about the fact that you now get a list of all your errors, and I want to demonstrate what that looks like. So here's the list. I double-click on it, and I take it to where the error occurs. In this case, the error says end if without block if. That's because I've sneakily commented out an if statement. Now, I'll point out another feature that we automatically indent statements to the proper indentation level. You can turn this feature off if for some reason it drives you crazy, but by default it's on, and I can go in and add constructs. All the indentation will be automatically just as appropriate. So when I remove that comment, everything shifts over appropriately. Okay. Believe me, I had to fight for that when people wanted to cut it. I told them they'd like it eventually. It's irritating. When it's buggy, it's irritating as heck because it wants to put stuff, in all kinds of random places. But they're getting the bug out. So the next error says overriding subadd must be declared with the overrides keyword. So that's easy enough. I add the overrides keyword here because this is a drive class and I'm overriding the add function. Last error message says check state, subcheck state is protected and is not accessible in this context. So I have to go up to check state. Hopefully I can find it. It was declared as protected. Well, that's not really what I want here. I want to be able to call it from my QTester class, which the QTester class creates random items to add into the queue, and it needs to call check state to verify the state of the queue occasionally. So change this to public. Notice that as soon as I move off the line, the compiler detects that the error has gone away. The compiler is always compiling on a background thread. So as soon as you introduce an error, it will add it to the task list. Something else I wanted to point out about the errors. Something else I wanted to point out about the errors is that did you notice how the error messages were clear and understandable? We worked hard to improve our error messages. We know that sometimes in the past, they seem to be talking about something that was totally unrelated to what the error actually was. So we worked hard to tell you what the error is, and where possible to make clear what you need to do to fix it. Okay, so let's run this QTester class. And what I've got is a little framework that I use to plug in these different tasks. These are actually running on a background thread, and I'll talk more about free threading later. So I'm going to launch the QTester, and I don't care about that breakpoint at the moment. So now I'm in the add method of dynamic queue. Dynamic queue inherits from the queue class, and what it does is when the queue becomes full, it will reallocate the underlying storage array, copy elements from the old array into the new array, and then continue. So it grows the array as needed. So this first call to add, I'll step through here. My base.add is delegating to the base class implementation. And there's the check. No, it's not full, so it inserts it in there. Returns back. Okay, let's look at what happens on the next call to add. This time, it's full. So we execute the throw. The throw takes me to the catch. The catch is going to be tested. Is the exception of the exception class, and does the message field of the exception contain full message of my class, which indicates that it's full? If it is, which it is in this case, then I resize the array and I delegate to the base class again to re-add it. Okay, let's remove that breakpoint. And I'll go through a little bit more of that demo in a bit. Get on to the next goal here is to make the language more simple and consistent. First item is the first two items are actually closely related. The support for default properties was added in an attempt to make the language simpler. And it's great when it works. You can have text 1, text box 1 equals text box 2, and it would assign contents of the text box rather than actually doing an object assignment. Hello, I need the slide. Wake up. Hello? I think they all took a break. Okay, cool. So, so as I was saying, the default properties. No, shoot, this is not the right slide. How did we get here, guys? Okay, so default properties were an attempt to make things simpler. Unfortunately, the result is that we had to add new constructs to deal with the fact that text box 1 sometimes meant the object text box 1, and it sometimes meant what's contained in the text box. So the result was the addition of the set statement. Now, we looked at this and we decided that was a mistake, that the complexity added by the set statement was not worth the benefit of the default properties. So we've eliminated set assignment. There's only one type of assignment. We've eliminated the problem that sometimes it wasn't clear to everybody when to use which type of assignment. They would write a regular assignment when what they meant was a set. And when they did that, the compiler wouldn't complain. It would merrily generate code that would do a default property assignment. But when it executed, that statement would fail. The next The next item is to always use parentheses around arguments. And good. So I probably don't need to say much about why it's great. You know that if you've had to switch from C to VB, you forgot to put in the parentheses. VB did something weird because it thought it meant something else. Anyway, next item. This is dim x on y's integer. I don't need to say anything more about that. The new operator is now the same for all classes. There was cases in VB6. There are cases in VB6, particularly MTS, for example, where if the object is registered with MTS, a new of the instance inside the same project in which the MTS class was defined wouldn't be registered with MTS, and so the semantics was different. It's consistent now. It's always the same. The last item is circuiting of and or operators. This lets you write code that is less complicated. You know, it's common in a while loop to have to say, while the variable is not nothing and something else. Well, when you wrote that way, it would crash when the thing became nothing, because even when the variable is nothing, it would go and evaluate the second part of the operand, which invariably access some method or property on the nothing. Okay, next goal is about writing robust code, writing code that will work when you ship it. There's no guarantees here. We're not solving the problem that you'll have bugs that you need to find, but we're helping you particularly to find situations where there's a potential for an unexpected runtime error. Parameterized constructors helps because without them, you had to have an init method on your class, which meant your class code was a little bit more complicated. It had to often deal with a state where the instance was created, but it wasn't initialized. And if you didn't have the code to deal with that state, then there were potential bugs where the instance was created, an exception was happened, and the init never got called. So you ended up with an object in this sort of halfway state. Variables can now be initialized where they're declared. So this means that you avoid the cases where you end up referencing a variable which is initialized to 0. VB always initialized variables to 0, which meant that your machine didn't crash, right, when that reference occurred, but it didn't work either. So there are often cases where initializing a class to nothing is not the right thing to do. It's not valid unless it refers to an instance. Circular references are cases where you have two or more objects, or one object or more, where there's a chain of references amongst those objects that's in a cycle. VB today is built its garbage collection. It's always had garbage collection, but it's based on reference counting. The reference counting came from OLE 2, standard way for clients to manage memory of OLE objects. The problem with it is that, of course, when you have the reference cycles, things never get released. So you ended up having to write some code that would set some variables to nothing or do something else that looked pretty wacky. And that code was often buggy. It's hard to deal with that problem. And it puts you back in having to deal with almost explicitly releasing objects. So the new garbage collector, it solves that problem. Decimal type is replacing currency, and the reason for that is that currency works most of the time. VB6 has support for decimal, but it's sort of marginal. It's only supported in variant. We really don't think there's a reason for people to continue to use currency because precision isn't quite enough in some cases for lira or whatever. Okay, robust type checking is important, and it's been discussed before. We disallow implicit conversions that can fail at runtime. So that's, the long to short conversion is an example. Assigning a variable that's typed as an interface to a class can fail at runtime because the interface might be being implemented by a different class. And so the default is this option is on. If you want to use the old style of programming, or if you're porting code over, you might want to turn it off. You can turn it off at project level for all the files, or you can turn it off in individual files. Also, when the option is on, late binding is disallowed. It's disallowed because the variable at runtime may well not reference an instance of the right type that has a method with a name. So again, you can still do late binding, but by default it's off. It has a real performance benefit in certain cases because there are times when you may end up with late bound calls where you didn't expect it. And you want to know about late bound calls because the performance of them is significantly less than of a regular typed function call. We also support overloaded methods. Overloaded methods is related to the robust typing because if I want to define a method that takes, say, a string and an integer, today the way to do that is to define your methods taking a variant. You can still use that style in VB.NET, but you can avoid the problem by defining an overloaded method. One of the methods explicitly takes an integer, the other explicitly takes a string. It avoids places where some client might be calling this thing in passing it whatever random thing, a double, for example, and you'll get a compile time error, whereas if the method is defined with a variant, you won't, because anything can be cast to a variant. We've also eliminated some of the evil type conversions. String to numeric conversion is no longer implicitly performed except in one case, and that's with the ampersand operator. So you can still use ampersand to concatenate numbers onto strings, and it'll convert the number to a string. But in general, we just won't do it unless you explicitly add the conversion. Arrays in VB today, if I define a method that takes an array, I can't say whether the type of that array is one-dimensional, two-dimensional, or some other dimension. So even though I know my method can only handle a one-dimensional array, there can be code in your program that passes it a two-dimensional array, and the compiler can't complain about it because it doesn't know. So arrays declarations in VB.NET explicitly specify the rank of the array. Support for the .NET frameworks. There's different areas here where this is essential. VB today, if you want to access the Windows platform, there's great books with many pages that you can go read to figure out how to do that. And in most cases, you can get it to work. But it's difficult. VB is now a first-class language of the platform. It will use the standard for writing libraries, for adding any new functionality to this platform has been defined, and it is a standard that is supported by all the languages in Visual Studio. C#, VB, C++, they can all methods that meet this standard just as easily as each other. The other thing that this standardization gives us is seamless language interoperability. You can, as has been said in other talks, you can inherit from VB, C#, VB without any problem. No more looking up in a book somewhere and saying, well, it's a string in VB, but that's a beaster in C++. File I/O names are no longer reserved. The statements, open, close, etc., we've moved those to be functions. And two reasons for that. One is that there's great new file I/O support provided by the runtime, provided by the framework. And so we encourage you to use that. We still support the old functions because you may have old data to read, or you might just think, that's what you're used to, I'm going to continue to use it. But moving them to functions also means that now you can define your own method name print. Define a method name open, a method name close, and so on. We're not going to say, sorry, that's a keyword, forget about it. Importing namespaces. So namespaces allow you to structure classes hierarchically. The VB runtime, for example, is in Microsoft.Visual Basic. And we also have, I think it's called Microsoft.Visual Basic compatibility, which functions that we are essentially deprecating, but we provide them to make it easy for you to move code one place to another. So anyway, the namespaces are fully supported in VB. If you've probably seen in some examples the namespace statement at the top, and that's how you define a namespace in VB. We're actually going to simplify things so that there's a default namespace associated with the project But if you want to, you can still use the namespace statement, and namespace statements can be nested without any problem to define levels in the hierarchy. We also support importing of namespaces, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. Okay, raw power. Delegates are essentially equivalent to function pointers, or they provide the functionality of function pointers, and they provide more, because you can point at a method of an instance. They essentially wrap up an instance and a method so that the object that can be passed around and invoked by anybody. Perhaps the most important thing about delegates that'll have the effect on people the most is that the event model of VB6 has been re-implemented on top of delegates. So this allows you to do things that you just couldn't do before. You can hook up a single method at runtime with a new add handler statement to be called whenever an event is fired. Before we had with events, we still support with events, but with events is different in that you have to essentially, you're dealing with all the events associated with a class. And you have to define ahead of time which methods are associated with the with events variable. You can also route many events of many objects to the same event handler. So if you want to have all your buttons on your form have the same, click event handler, which that seems unlikely as an example, but drag over or whatever, then it's easy to do that. Free threading is an example of where we really get great benefits by having this common runtime between all the languages. The folks on our team really didn't have to do very much to support free threading. In fact, we could have done nothing at all and you still would get free threading because we're using completely built on top of the frameworks, and the frameworks have a threading class that you can use to instantiate new threads. We did add one construct, which is the sync lock statement, which is used to synchronize access to critical places where you may have race conditions that don't lock out other people from manipulating the data at the same time. Okay, let's look at free threading example. So, as I mentioned, this application, and you can run it in the lab. I encourage you to go over to the lab and play with the new product. You can play with this application. You can also try out whatever you like of the features that I'm talking about today, or even features. You can read about ones that aren't there. There's documentation on the disk on your CD that talks about some of the other features. I'm certainly covering the major ones here, but there's a few other minor ones. So this application launches tasks on threads. If I click on Launch Fractal, that launches a window. It's going to paint a fractal image inside of the window. It uses interfaces. Every one of the tasks, the Q tester, the fractal image painter, and so forth, implement the task interface. And I'll just quickly show you what the interface looks like. So here's the definition, interface task, and when you declare members, just list the member name. You just list the first line of the declaration, okay? And notice that there is an event in here too, which is interesting. meaning that everybody who implements this interface should also raise this event. In this case, they're supposed to raise an event that says when they're done with, when their task is completed. So that's used to remove the entry from the task list. Okay, back to where? The active tasks form. Okay, we're in launch task. When I clicked on that launch fractal button, it created a new instance of my fractal form class, passed in here. The fractal form, I should point out one more thing about interfaces, which is we've actually changed the syntax for how you implement interfaces. For example, here is the implementation of the start task. So rather than having to define your implementation method as, task _ start task, you give it whatever name you like. And you add this clause on the end that says, well, this method implements the task, the start task method. Okay, so we step through here. This line of code is creating a new thread. Just quickly mention that the semantics of this new statement as declaration statements have changed. When they have new here, we immediately create instance. We don't automatically generate code every time it references it. Oh, are you nothing? Well, then I better create an instance. That was a bit inefficient. So this is just simply shorthand for dim thread as a thread equals new thread address of task. So it's just shorthand for initialization syntax. Okay, so this creates a new thread. It passes in what says address of task.startTask, which was the method I just showed you. And that's going to be the method that gets invoked on the background thread. It stores the thread instance inside a property of the task. This add handler statement is the dynamic event hookup. So the way that works is this statement is saying that for the onComplete event of the task object, or the task variable in this case, hook up task completed as the function to be called. And there's a similar remove handler statement which does the opposite. So now it's creating a new task list item, incrementing task ID. It adds this thing, adds the item to the list of items, and starts the thread. So there's the fractal. Oop. And let's start up another one. Oops. Need to remove that breakpoint. And you can see how it paints the two fractal images simultaneously. Okay. All right. Work that time. Performance. This is another big benefit of the .NET framework that we get for using it for our runtime implementation. In particular, the performance has been improved for manipulation of class instances. And I'm not going to say that the performance across the board is going to be faster for all types of things, but in particular, it's faster for manipulation of classes. The first example is reference assignment for arrays. When I assign an array today in V6, it creates a whole copy of the array. And instead, by default in VB.NET, that will be a reference assignment. You can explicitly clone the array if you want to make a copy, but the default is reference assignment. So instead of creating copies of huge arrays, it will just share the reference to the array. The instance size is much smaller on VB, on the .NET frameworks. The minimal size for an instance in VB today is something like 60 bytes. I don't remember the exact number. In .NET frameworks, it's 8 bytes. So you can feel a lot better about creating a ton of class instances and not sucking up all your memory. Also, so there's faster object manipulation also includes faster creation of instances, faster assignment of instances. Faster assignment comes from the switch from reference counting to a trace and garbage collector. Reference counting means that every time you have an assignment, there's a call. There's a call to release, and there's a call to add ref. So rather than, copying 4 bytes around, having to make several calls. So assignment is much faster. And also, the .NET framework supports direct data member access. So you can define a data member on your class, and if you're not worried about versioning issues, you're not worried that somebody, if these classes are closely related, it's not a problem, then you can directly access the data member on another instance rather than having to go through the property function. Okay, so we've got one more demo here. See if we can shut all this down. No. Okay, I wrote a little performance tester in VB6 and in VB.NET. They're actually very similar, and they do the same thing. So the first test is object creation. So to create 100,000 large objects on this machine, VB6, it takes about 2 seconds. VB.NET, 0.578 seconds. Assignment test, this one's a little bit unfair because VB6 to do all those calls, but VB6, 10 million assignments were 2.3 seconds. Woo! And the last one is a bit of a more real-world case where I've got code that is creating an array of employee records, employee objects, and then it sorts them with quicksort algorithm. So 10,000 employees takes 0.4 seconds in V6. 0.016 in VB.NET. Okay, so the summary is we've given you the features that you've asked for. We've made the language more modern. We've made it simpler, easier to understand, easier to read your code, easier to pick up somebody else's code and not have to worry about there being a Go sub there. We've made it more robust, easier to find the errors before you ship your product. Actually, before you even hit F5, it will tell you some errors. We've also provided you full access to the .NET platform. So I really can't stress enough how important this is, that it's now a first-class language on the platform. It's incredibly exciting to me. Your skills and your investments will move forward in the language. It's still got the same basic look and feel. We've changed some things, we've cleaned them up, but we believe that the changes that we've made will really benefit everybody, not just new people coming to the language, but it will benefit the existing programmers as well. The related sessions have already happened, but they told me to include this anyway because apparently you can order videotapes of these sessions. I expect most of you went to yesterday's What's New talk on Visual Basic. Another talk that would be good to be able to hear is the introduction to C#. And the reason I say that is that VB and C# have very similar functionality. They provide pretty much all of the same features. A couple of features in C# that aren't in VB, they support the ability to write what's called unsafe code, and that's using pointers. And they also support operator overloading. And I can neither confirm nor deny that we'll try to add these features in a later version of VB. References, they're on your CD. There's Visual Basic Language reference. It's not done. We haven't had time to update the entire reference. There's also something that's pretty exciting, which is there is now a specification for the language. And that's on your CD as well. Okay, let's open it up for questions.
Array bases used to be zero-based arrays, one-based arrays, collections were one-based. What's the basis on these now?
So we are moving to totally zero-based.
That includes collections? Collections will be zero?
That includes collections.
Yes.
Yeah, all the collections in the .NET framework are zero-based. I think we still support our old collection implementation, and we put it in the compatibility namespace, so that one is one-based. But everything else is we're moving to a standard of zero-based. I think we're having a discussion right now, actually, about zero-based indexing into strings. And I think for consistency, we should just do the same thing there.
I noted that you had you would define task as task, and the first task was lowercase, and the second task was uppercase.
Mm-hmm.
Are we case sensitive now?
No, we're not case sensitive. With I could have just used the same case there. It's the same thing you do in VB6. You can have a variable declared with the same name as a type. So we really, we wanted to stay away from the painful thing where you can't remember exactly what the case something was used and type it in and it doesn't match. So we're still case insensitive, and eventually I think we'll add the feature that used to be there in VB6 that when you type in something and the case doesn't match, it'll adjust the case appropriately.
Earlier in the sessions, it was said that we were no longer tied to the data reporter, that's kind of gone away. So how do we print now? The printing mechanism in the new model.
That one I'm going to have to defer you. I suggest you go to ask the experts on that one because I don't know the answer.
Okay, thanks.
Yep. Next, over here.
I just wanted to thank you and your team for making it easier for me to earn a paycheck. And
you're very welcome. I'm not sure exactly what you mean by that, but
more time on the golf course.
Oh, okay. Good.
And also, just to quickly clarify something, if I do dim XYZ as integer equal 5, does everything equal 5?
So that's obviously a weird one, and what we decided was that we're just going to have to say that when you use the initialization syntax, you can only define a single variable.
Okay.
Yeah, over here.
Would it make more sense to go against the .NET framework directly, or to go use the VB implementation of it? Is there going to be any performance difference? Like for file, is there going to be different syntax for the, accessing the .NET framework objects?
So the file objects are just objects in the framework, and accessing them from VB is the same as accessing them from any other language in terms of performance.
It's not a wrapper?
No, not a wrapper.
Great.
So our compatibility functions are, we have ones that are compatible with VB6. Those are wrappers. For file I/O, the wrapping is not going to show up on any profiling, but for other things, there may be cases where you see a slight difference because of wrapping. Yeah.
I have a couple of really quick ones. The implementation of forms now, what will be the file format for those? FRM still exist, or will be using something else?
So the model is pretty different now. The designers, like the form designer, they actually generate code. The definition of the form is purely code. So it's great in that you can go in and actually, if the designer does something that you don't like or you want to make some tweak, you just go in there and tweak the code.
VB code?
It's VB code.
Okay.
Yep.
Will you be able to create forms by name?
Pardon?
Will you be able to create a new instance of a form by a string name? You've never been able to do that before. If I wanted to have an array of form names and iterate through that array and create instances of those, can you do that yet?
I don't know that there's a way to do that.
Okay, real quick, last one.
I'm sure there's a way to do it like indirectly by making calls to reflection, the reflection libraries that are in the framework, but there's no real simple way of doing it.
Okay. Scripting support, will that be available in there? If I wanted to give my end users a VBA, like what you're giving today, will that be available too for this?
So, eventually.
Okay.
For like Office and
if I,
sort of
like if I was doing Visio, I would want to provide scripting.
It's not going to be there right away.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
There are certain things that the UI needs to do in certain applications, and to be able to get to certain functions or certain repaints or certain events, you have to subclass. I see delegates. How exactly are we going to be able to subclass or extend current controls to be able to have that kind of functionality?
So that's just using the inheritance, the inherit statement, right? You just create your control. You say inherits from the 3D button or whatever, and then you override methods as appropriate.
Thank you.
Sure.
Yeah, I noticed you changed. Well, there was you made some changes to the error objects or the error decoding, but and you added line numbers. Have you thought about creating, allowing us to be able to build a debug build compile so that when we get an error, we can get a line number in the error object?
So we still support ERL for on-air go-to.
Yeah, but that's
sure what the decision was there. But for structured error handling, the .NET Frameworks has a rich classes that allow you to get information about where an error occurs. But you should ask the frameworks folks really for the answer to your question, because I don't know exactly what all information is in there. I don't think there's a line number, however.
okay. Well, I'm just thinking during runtime, obviously, having some way of locating an error. It's not really practical to put error, logic on every single line.
Right.
And so you need some mechanism locating an error.
Yes. So if you really need that fine-grained control, you can still use on-air go-to. But ERL is not supported for structured error handling.
Okay.
Yeah.
A couple of questions. In C# they added two really nice features. I wonder if VB has the same. The / self-documenting code.
I'm working on that one.
Okay.
I'm working on it.
Okay, that's really good. And the other one is to call the to call the base class method when you are specializing or deriving. you have to know the name of the base class, or and you do like in C#, you can have the base dot operator.
Right. It's similar. You cannot use the name of the base class. You have to say my base dot.
Oh, it's my base.
To refer to your base class. There's also my class dot,
Okay.
which allows you to make calls to an overridable method, but ensure that the one that you actually call is not the overridden one, but the implementation in your class.
Yeah, in your example, I thought you can inherit it from something called MyBase, but that's just the generic
No,
name.
that's the name of the qualifier.
Great. Thanks.
Okay.
A couple quick questions. Number one, I'm hoping that you're restricted from entering any code in an interface definition.
Yes.
Okay.
No code there.
Question number two, just refresh my memory on the delegator and the purpose of the delegator.
Delegates?
Delegate, sorry, yes.
Yeah, it's so personally I don't like that name because I find it a little bit confusing. But anyway, I would prefer to call it like a method pointer or something. That's confusing because it's different than the C++ method pointer. What it's about is you can take like an object, a particular instance of an object, and specify a method on that object, and it creates what's called a delegate instance. We use the address of operator to indicate that. So you say address of, my variable dot method. You pass that to somebody else, and they call on that delegate instance, they call invoke. The invoke method has to have exactly the same parameters as the one that you created the delegate instance with. And it allows, so it'll turn around and then call the instance. So you can use them as simple function pointers, as callbacks, for example. I could define a sort method where I wanted somebody to pass in a function which did the comparison. I can use it for that. But it's also used for events because, for example, the code behind a form, the class that implements my form, hooks up to event on the controls by actually passing a delegate that refers to your handlers to the control.
Okay, thanks.
Yep. Sure.
While you were short-circuiting and OR, did you short-circuit immediate if also, so that it doesn't evaluate the two conditions?
Sorry. It's not gonna happen this time around. Immediate if today is simply a runtime function.
Okay. The other question I had is, it seems that the changes that you've made to Visual Basic this round are the greatest changes in semantic ever. And it's the upgrade path can be like for VB6 code to VB.NET.
So the upgrade path is that we're providing a conversion tool. The conversion tool converts a lot of things. It will convert even like VB forms to Win forms, and it does some conversion for data access, but it doesn't do everything. So what it does is it will actually generate undone comments in your code saying, well, you're going to need to do something with this because converter can't always figure out what you mean in your code. So you have to actually go in there and make the modifications yourself in a lot of cases. It also generates a report saying what it found, sort of conversions that it made. We're also going to make sure that we provide as much resources as possible through, white papers, books, news groups, etc., to assist users with moving their code.
So there's no compatibility mode like SQL 6.5 to 7
There
where
is
everything just
no
works?
compatibility mode.
Okay.
There's VB6. Pardon? I'm not sure I believe that. But if all the expressions you specified in if and only if will be evaluated, right? Because it's just a function call. So if I have whatever expressions I specify on the call, they'll all get evaluated. right? This is Jim Canfield. You can ask him about the if and only if he claims that I'm wrong. Where were we? Who's next?
Right here. I really liked your benchmark comparisons between VB6. Have you run them against C#?
No, but when we ship this thing, I feel confident we're going to make, we're going to have the same performance. There are cases today where C# has better performance, and that's partly because they ended up getting ahead of us in the implementation. But there's no fundamental reason why the performance should be any different at all. We're on the same runtime, right?
Sounds good.
So I think it'll when we ship this product, it'll be the same.
Good. And one quick one. Anything about do you now allow publicly declared arrays?
Yes.
Good. Thank you.
Yep. Over here.
How will integration of VB.NET with COM+ look like? Will we be able to create good objects, or will we be able to integrate into COM+ at all?
So, again, that's really a question for the frameworks folks. They have been working very hard. I can answer what I know about it. They have been working very hard to enable interoperability between COM and COM+ objects and the .NET frameworks. So any object that you define that already exists, you can load that in from the .NET frameworks and use it. And the reverse is true. When I build a .NET framework, you can use those instances from COM. So there's a few cases where things don't behave the exact same way. For example, if I have a derived class in the .NET frameworks, well, it's not going to appear like a derived class in the COM on the COM side because COM doesn't support inheritance.
Yes, but in VB6 we could set these attributes like uses transaction, and if an object is an MTS or a COM+ object at all.
So we'll have those too.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Can I pass an object now by value across processes?
Yes. Can.
Excellent. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. I think the way you do that, I believe, is by inheriting from a particular class. That you have to inherit from a class that supports that semantics. Also, structures, of course, are much richer now, and they'll all, if those are passed, that'll be. I'm pretty sure that's by value. Yeah.
So I was wondering, did do events go away?
No, the WinForms, I believe, has that same functionality.
Thank you.
Yeah.
If I have an uninheritable class, what happens if I try and inherit that from C#?
You get an error in compile time because it's marked in the metadata description of the class that it's not inheritable. So you'll immediately get the compiler telling you either the reverse situation as well, non-inheritable in C#, inherit from VB. You'll get an error saying that
so
you
same
can't
as possible in C#.
Yeah. And it's and in fact the IntelliSense dropdowns will not list the class when you say inherits. You shouldn't list any classes that aren't inheritable. Yeah. We've just got we've just got a minute left. I'll just go down here, and you can come up and ask whatever questions you like. I'll also be at the Ask the Experts session tonight, so you can grab me there and ask me any questions. Thanks very much.